So, yeah, welcome everybody. I'm Adam Linnett from Cheshire Wildlife Trust, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar about swifts, towns and villages. And hopefully, by the end of this, we're not only going to inspire you to take action for these wonderful birds, but we're going to tell you how you can take action as well. I'm going to give it a few minutes just for people to join us. So somewhere on your screen, there should be a chat function. So if you can find that, we'll kick it in the chat till people join us. So if you can tell me if you've already seen your first swift this year and where you've seen it, and then we'll wait for everyone to join us and we'll run through the through everything that we need to run through. There we go. We've got Kate and Millie who've already seen swifts up in Bollington, which is nice, fairly local to me. We've got Susanna who's seen 5 last week over in the Eastern Macclesfield. Excellent. We must have somebody from the west of the county joining us. We can't all be over in the east. No swifts in High Sutton just yet for Tina. Another 5 over Macclesfield for Dave. Great stuff.
Adam, sorry to interrupt, but there's a black box in the middle of the screen. I'm not sure if everyone else can see that.
Yeah, no, that's just so I can see the chat, and then I'll hide it in a second.
Ah, okay, no worries.
There we go. I'll move it out your way at least. Cup and lower Pever for Cat. Oh, 50 over in Reedsmere. Brilliant. So they are coming through. So I think that this wet weather, and it's been a fairly cold spring, is probably delaying them a little bit. And even if they are back, they're probably tucked away at the moment and not being that obvious to people. Tell you what we'll do is we'll make a start. I make it almost 5 past now. So hopefully anybody that's not with it will catch us up on the recording. So I saw my first swifts this year over in Congleton. There's about 5 or 6 birds, and I kind of took 5 minutes to kind of soak them in a little bit. You know, it's such a wonderful thing to see these birds back from their wintering grounds over in Africa. And, you know, it's such a joy to hear the calls and to see them back with us breeding. But through obviously my knowledge of these birds and getting prepped for this webinar, that kind of joy and that happiness of seeing them was slightly tinged with knowing that rather than seeing 6 birds, I probably should have been seeing about 13, 14 birds. And that's what I would have seen 25 years ago. So even within my lifetime, these birds have suffered some really drastic declines. So we'll touch on that in a little bit. But it was great to see them. But what I want to see is even more of them. So I'm going to close the chat now. Chat amongst yourselves. I'm going to, hopefully, there we go. So there is a chat function. You can chat amongst yourselves. Keep it clean, keep it lean. It's a family event. And it's being recorded as well, just to make you aware of that. And then we're going to have a section for Q&A. So hopefully you can find that panel somewhere on your screen. And there's some Q&As at the end. So if you think of a question, post it there, and hopefully we'll get round to it by the end of the presentation. If we don't, then we'll send around a thank you, a follow-up email, where I'll answer any questions that I don't have time for today. So in this webinar, we're going to look at a few things. So first of all, why swifts? Why are we so concerned about swifts at the moment? Then helping you to identify them, especially from those similar species like swallows and house martins. And then we'll tell you how to record where they are, and then how to take action for them as well. And I think that's one of the key drivers for this webinar. Is we want people out there taking action for swifts, not just spending an hour learning about them. There we go. So why swifts? So I always love a good graph, me. This one quite not so much, to be honest, because it shows the decline of swift populations in the last 25 years. So starting from 1994 and running up to 2019, they declined by over 61% across the whole of the UK. Now, to me, that was quite a startling statistic, because as I said, this is within my lifetime. Usually when we talk about the declines of wildlife, we're going back to the 1960s and the 1970s. Long before I was born. Don't mean to cause any jealousy amongst anybody else that's watching the webinar, but that was before I was born. But this is within my lifetime, so it really hit home for me that swifts are in real trouble. And it's something that if we don't do something about, we could actually see these birds going extinct really, really quickly. But that's a national picture. Maybe it's not so bad for Cheshire. It's not quite as bad for Cheshire, but it's not great either. So this are, again, loads of data, so I'll just pick a few bits out. This is the survey data from the South East Cheshire Ornithological Society, going back to 1995, and then repeat surveys 2001, 2019. Now, there are in there for Holmes Chapel, and towards the bottom, you can see 1995, we had about 27 breeding pairs in Holmes Chapel. 2019, no breeding pairs at all recorded in Holmes Chapel. So there's a chance there that they've gone extinct in that town already. Middlewich, we've gone from 53 pairs in 2001 down to just 5 pairs in 2019. Again, if we don't do something there, Middlewich will have lost all of its swifts within the last 20 years or so. But most alarming for me is we had a colony in Crewe known as a super colony. There was 450 pairs there, so I'll just picture that for a moment. 450 pairs, so over 900 birds at this time of year returning to that colony, all flying around that airspace, all screaming. It must have been an absolute joy to behold. And I've had people tell me they used to visit that colony on an annual basis as like a day trip to Crewe to go and see the spectacle. In the last 25 years, that's gone from 450 pairs, possibly the biggest colony in the whole of the UK, down to just 50 pairs. Now possibly not even the biggest colony in Cheshire, and probably not even the biggest one in Crewe. So Alton Street, just around the corner, still got 60 pairs recorded there. So kind of really shocking declines happening on our patch. And that one in Crewe is something I definitely think we need to be looking at and doing something about. So that's why we're worried about swifts. They are facing some seriously quick declines. The other reason we're interested in swifts is it's actually relatively quick and relatively easy for people to take action for these birds. And you can do it right on your doorstep. It's not something you need to have a car to drive out to a nature reserve to volunteer. This is something that you can do to look after your local wildlife. So it's a brilliant kind of way of mobilising people and get them taking action. So that's why we're interested in swifts as well. So what's causing those declines? Now, one of the biggest reasons for those declines is the loss of nesting spaces. So swifts predominantly nest in pre-1944 houses, so anything built before the Second World War. And that's because they tend to have more open spaces, more open eaves and things like that. More modern houses have, as you can see there, top left, fascia boards, soffits, board ends, no entrance at all for swifts to get into their favourite nesting spaces up in the roofs of houses. On top of that, a lot of those older houses, particularly social housing estates, are starting to get their fascias and soffits put in over their houses. So they're starting to lose their natural, their normal nesting spaces as well. So a real concern there about where they nest. But also thinking about their food declines. There was a study out in Germany that I think said over 70% loss of invertebrate biomass in the last 50, 60 years. So a huge loss of food for these birds as well. So they feed purely on the wing, so anything they can catch up in the air. And a lot of their food, you might not think of it, is actually spiders. They do this thing called ballooning, where they throw out a thread of silk, the wing picks them up, and it takes them off into the air. So I think 1 in 5 invertebrates sampled through sweep nets up in the air is actually spiders. So a huge food part of the food for swifts is spiders, as well as other flying invertebrates. What's causing their declines? Well, if you look at the garden top right, I'm pretty sure we can all relate to seeing gardens like this where we live. Fake turf, Indian stone, no hedges, absolutely no space for wildlife at all. So things like that are an issue. but the built environment is only about 3 to 5% of land use in the UK. 70% is agricultural. The intensification of agriculture is one of the biggest drivers of wildlife loss in the UK. Now, that's not to demonise farmers. We realise that farmers need to make a living. And if the farmer next door is being more intensive, producing food more cheaply, and is undercutting your prices, you've not really got much choice if you want a viable business than to compete with him. And ultimately, we as society, we drive that change. We enjoy having cheap food. So it's not all naughty farmers, but it presents a really big chance to make a difference to wildlife if we can influence the way that 70% of land is farmed. And we as society can do that because we can drive that change with the money in our pockets. So we'll come back to taking action and we'll touch on that again, but these are the main reasons why swifts are declining. So identifying them. Hopefully in the last couple of slides I've shown you why swifts are in some real trouble and kind of got you thinking about how we can help them. So if you want to do that, the first thing you need to find is where your nearest swifts are, and as part of that you're going to have to identify them. So here are their commonest species, their most similar species. So we've got barn swallow on the left, swallow to most people, but barn swallow is technically the correct name. You can tell it by its bright red face, very distinctive amongst the other birds on the slide. It's white underside and that long tail. The males in particular have long tail streamers, and they'll often sit on wires and give their call, their song. It's quite distinctive. The next slide will talk about calls and songs. Probably most similar to that is house martin in the middle. It doesn't have that red face, but it does have a white chin, and the white extends all the way under that underside, and it has a very distinctive white rump, which you can probably just see there at the top of the tail, just tucked behind the wings. And especially if it's flying low over water, you'll be able to pick that white rump out really, really easily. And to my mind, it has the most angular kind of shape of these three species. So swallows tend to be kind of more slick, more long. House martins tend to be more triangular, almost like triangle in shape, yeah, kind of straight edge wings. And then the swifts tend to have these beautiful, kind of almost like boomerang shaped, sickle shaped wings, like a real arc flying through the sky. They're all black on the underside, technically dark brown, not really black, with just a tiny white patch under the chin. If you see a swift with any more white on it than that, I'd suggest you probably get in touch with your friend who's the local twitcher. You've probably got more of a rarity turning up. But swifts tend to be much darker underneath than all these other birds. So, calls. Hopefully I can bring up, there we go. So hopefully everyone knows Xenocanto. It's a really good database for birdsong. You have to make sure you get the right name, which is why I said barn swallow rather than swallow. So here we've got common swift, and you can see the list of recordings, and you can pick whichever one you want. So I'm going to pick this one here, recorded in Spain, and hopefully there we go. So there you go, you can hear the screaming call of swifts. Now that's basically as diverse as their call gets, and you'll end up with what's known as screaming parties. And they'll kind of scream around the territories, and often later in the summer they'll scream higher up as they're feeding as well. So really, really distinctive. You're not going to hear anything else that sounds quite like common swifts screaming. Now just to touch on the others.
Adam, sorry to interrupt again. I think people are struggling to see your screen for some reason. It's gone blank.
Right.
I'm not sure why that is.
Let's try that one. Is that any better, Rosie?
Yeah, we can see that now. Brilliant.
Perfect. There we go. So yeah, Xenocanto. So this is a recording for barn swallow. Now to me, swallow song or call is almost more warble-like. It's kind of more bouncy. Let's have a quick listen. That sounds to me like a female calling to the male, so let's pick a different one. There we go. And that row of clicks there is really distinctive for me with swallows. As I said, often given from a perch, but quite distinctive from that screaming call of swifts. And the other one was house martin. And again, the song's really quite simple. And let's find it. There we go. That's as much song as you get out of a house martin. So really quite simple, almost like a little trill, almost like little stones knocking together. Is how I tend to recognise house martins from swallows and swifts. But the main thing is, if you see that sickle shape, and if you see that, hear that screaming call, then you know you've got swifts. Just checking we're back on the correct screen there, everyone. So you know you've got swifts. And the other thing to think about with them is obviously they're summer migrant. So swallows, house martins tend to come back earlier, probably into April. Swifts tend to be the first week of May. So you can see there on the left their migration. They tend to leave us probably round about late July into August. Some will hold on a little bit later than that. But they'll then head down to Africa where they'll spend the winter, and they'll start heading back up for us again back here in May. Now the young tend to go first. It's a brilliant evolutionary trick, bird migration, because they don't follow the parents. Now the plus side to that is if your parents don't make it through the summer, but you manage to fledge, you still know where you're going to your wintering grounds. So the young tend to go first, then followed by the males, and then followed by the females later in the year as well. Upon returning, they'll look for nest sites, incredibly site loyal, love nesting in colonies, and tend to return to that same site, even the same nest with the same partner year on year. Now, they don't tend to breed successfully until they're about 4 years old, and those that make it to that age can expect to live maybe another 4 or 6 years, breeding each year, having 2 or 3 eggs at a time, usually laid 2 or 3 days apart, and they'll start incubating straight away. So you end up with this staggered hatching of the eggs as well, so you end up with bigger chicks and smaller chicks. And sometimes, obviously, the smaller ones don't tend to make it, and the bigger ones tend to get out of the nest. Once they've hatched, the adults will go off and feed, so you can see there top right with the crop full of food, a little pouch under the chin, absolutely stuffed full of invertebrates. And they can return to the nests as infrequently as every couple of days, which is why finding nest sites can be quite difficult. It's not like blue tits and great tits that are in and out of box maybe every couple of minutes. You know, they're flying in at speed, and if you miss it, you might have to wait another couple of days for your chance to see exactly where they're nesting. So they can be quite difficult to spot. The other thing with the eggs is if we have weather like today, which is a bit wet, the young will actually go into a state of torpor. They lower their body temperature, they lower their metabolic rate, and they actually virtually shut down, and they can do that for a good couple of days as well. But that will extend their period of staying in the nest. But it does mean if we have a wonderful British summer, that swifts have still got a good chance of fledging some young. So mapping and recording. So now hopefully you know why we need to save swifts, you know what they look like, and you can go out and do some surveys and report some data back to us and to everyone else too. And so there's loads of different places you can send records to. A few different ornithological societies, there's the county recorder. Where we're directing people towards is the Swift Mapper app or the website, which is run by the RSPB. But all that data then is public access. So you can see where other people are seeing swifts in your town, in your county, and then you can start to think about where those colonies are and where it's best then to take action for those birds. So you can see here I've got a map of Congleton, and what I tend to tell people to do is probably not record them over areas of open water. So you can see some there that are just over Asprey Mere down in Congleton. That's probably where they're going to feed, but it might be a little bit misleading then when you're trying to think about where their colonies are. This is a really good way of starting to build that bigger picture of where swifts are where you live, but it's not always a full picture. So I know that now on the Holmes Chapel Road, there's definitely 3 or 4 swifts that nest there every year, because I tend to see them. So the next time I see them, I'm going to get my phone out, go on the Swift Mapper app and log them that they're there. Now, the other things you can record with this, so the blue ones are sightings, the yellow symbols are for nests or known nests. So you can really then kind of hone in on where those colonies are. And there's a green logo as well that's not on here that is for nest boxes that have been put up. And the red one that you can see is nests that are known to be at risk or where previous colonies were. So again, building up a much better picture of where swifts are in your area. Now for Stockport, we have a wild Stockport team, and they're looking for 5 streets to come forward to become swift streets. So if you've got sightings of swifts, or if you're interested in that, if you follow the link at the bottom, again, we'll send it out in the thank you email, and record them there, then hopefully that can help our team take action for swifts right up in the north of the county. Now, if you decide you want to go into a little bit more detail with your recording, you could probably set up a spreadsheet like this. So this is one from our friends at Swift over Macclesfield. So if you're acting on a scale of a town or a village, or maybe even just a street, this allows you to get even more data, more detail, and delve down into it. Now, as I said, things like building age can be quite important, because then you can start to see if it is the older buildings that your swifts are nesting in, and therefore that might be something to conserve. It might be in new builds, if they're putting in things like Swift bricks, and that might be something then to encourage other developers to do. So getting that a little bit more detail out of your surveys can be really, really key in taking more action for swifts where you live. Again, we can send this around as an attachment to a thank you email, so you can have a look at it, maybe add things to it if you want to, and see how it works for you on the ground where you live. So once you've that's doing sightings and recording the sightings, and once you've figured out where the colonies are, the data that I showed you from South East Cheshire Ornithological Society, they were doing colony counts. It's actually a way of assessing how many breeding birds there might be in that colony. Now, you tend to do this in early June, so maybe in a couple of weeks' time, and pick a nice still evening, probably from about 8 o'clock onwards, and you want to record any sightings of those birds, but pay a particular attention to low-flying birds, so anything below 50 metres or within 20 metres of rooftops. And basically, how many birds you count at that point, you assume is how many pairs that you have. And that's because one of the adults will be on the eggs and all the others will be out flying, and therefore it's a good representation of numbers. Another thing to keep an eye out for are bangers. So non-breeding birds or young birds kind of looking for future nest sites will do what's known as banging, which is they'll fly past a nest box or a nest site and they'll knock on it basically with their wings and see if anybody's home. And if they hear a scream from inside, then they know someone else is in there. And if they don't, then they might come and investigate that as a possible nest site for next year. So again, that can be a really good way of identifying where birds are looking to nest. And if all the nest boxes are currently occupied, then that's the place to go and put up some more nest boxes for those birds to nest in future years. The other thing to look out for are arcs, which is where they tend to fly really low, literally at rooftop height as they're coming into their nest sites as well. So another really good indicator that they're definitely breeding in the area that you're looking at. So we've now mapped our swifts, we know where the colonies are, and we know that they like to build upon existing colonies. It's not as simple as stick a nest box up anywhere and swifts will move into it. They almost have to be part of an existing colony. So I'd imagine for most of you, putting up nest boxes is probably one of the actions that you're going to be looking at taking. Now, they come in a whole host of different shapes, forms, sizes, materials. If you look at, and again, we'll send the link out, swiftconservation.org, they've got a list of all the different varieties, and there's much discussion about what works best, what doesn't work so well, what's the best shape, what's the best material. So I thought I'd just show you a few. So the ones up on the left-hand side, you can see this would look from the inside of a house looking out. They've obviously got a Swift brick put in where they're coming through. You can see the entrance hole where the sunlight's coming through, and then nest boxes on the other side that are open backed. And that means that you can go in and you can monitor them. If you're into bird ringing, you want to track the movements of these birds, figure out their age, their breeding productivity, and you can ring them as well. That's probably not going to be your go-to if you're approaching people in the street to put in nest boxes, because most people's concern around nesting birds in their houses is the smell of the drop-ins, the live food being brought back in, all those sorts of things. So that's probably not going to be your go-to. But if you can convince somebody to do that, actually the research you could get out of doing things like bird ringing on a colony like that would be fantastic. So it's always something to keep in mind. What you're probably going to go for is over on the right-hand side, which is a wooden nest box, kind of retrofitted to the outside of the house, right up under the eaves. Again, loads of debate about the right size of the entrance hole, whether it should be at side, in the middle, underneath. Have a look, do some research on the Swift Conservation website and see what the latest thinking is, because it's always evolving and it's always changing. But yeah, the Swift Conservation website is probably the place to go to kind of get that information. What I will say with putting up those nest boxes, there's a couple of things. One, you want to make them out of something that's going to last a long time. You don't want to be having to go up a ladder and replace that box every 2 or 3 years. You want something that's going to be put up there and last as long as possible. So that might be a different type of material, or it might be using a decent grade of timber when you build the boxes. In terms of putting them up as well, working at heights isn't for everybody. I'm not a great fan of climbing up ladders, especially holding a hammer, a drill, a nest box, all the rest of it. But also, if you're working on other people's properties to put up nest boxes, you might want to think about insurance. And again, you probably won't have that. So what a few of the groups that we're working with tend to do is hiring like a local handyman, a window cleaner. If you've got somebody like BT operating nearby and they've got a cherry picker, that tends to work quite well. If you've got some renovation work going on a house and there's already scaffolding put up, it's a brilliant chance to get a box put up really quickly, really easily. So keep an eye out for things like that. But just think about how you put that box up safely, and especially if you're thinking about doing it on somebody else's property, things like insurance. So that's probably where most of your action is going to go, is putting these wooden nest boxes. What you can also do is try and get more Swift bricks put in when places are being renovated or when they are being built in the first place. We'll kind of touch back onto like planning policy and new builds having Swift bricks put into them, but they tend to be quite good. They either come like the one on the left, where it's an entrance just into the loft space, or they'll come as a self-contained unit. So there's none of that, you know, oh, well, what about the smell on the inside of the house, or live food escaping, all that sort of thing. They're all completely self-contained. So they're much more user-friendly for the residents downstairs, as well as the residents that are using the boxes. But maybe you live in a bungalow and boxes really should only be on the 2nd floor upwards. So you can't put boxes up on your property. So what else could you do for Swifts? Well, you could tackle that other issue of invertebrate declines. Now, one of the best things you can do in your garden for insect life is dig a pond. Doesn't have to be massive, as long as it's probably about 3 foot deep to escape the worst of the winter weather. Putting a pond in, really, really good. We're currently in the middle of May, so it's no-mow May. If a lot of you are doing that, put the lawnmower away for a week and see for a month and see what wildflowers grow up through your lawn. And maybe you're thinking about creating a wildflower patch. Now, there's a good way of doing that, which is the one in the middle, which is a native perennial wildflower mix. And there's a not quite so good way of doing it, which is the one on the left, which is a cornfield annual mix. Now, the one on the left is good for things like bees and butterflies, lots of flowers, lots of nectar. What it's not so great for is the larval stages of a host of invertebrate species. And that's because those plants aren't always native species. The ones in the middle, with them being native, are much more likely to provide food for the larval stages of beetles, flies, virtually anything you can think of. So to give you an example, oxeye daisy, native perennial, is known to be the food plant for about 20 different larval stages of different species. Cornflowers are the larval food plant for about 4. So there's a huge difference there in the amount of invertebrate life your meadow is going to host if you plant natives versus cornfield annuals. So just keep that in mind. It's not always about bees and butterflies, it's about the other things that will live on wildflowers as well. But maybe you don't have a garden. So what can you do if you live in a bungalow without a garden, or in a flat that you rent and you can't put nest boxes up? Well, you can be an ethical consumer. You can think about where you buy your food from. Is that from a wildlife friendly farm? You can think about where you buy virtually anything from. You know, is what you buy, what you consume, having a negative impact on the environment, or a positive, or as positive as it can be, impact on the environment? Maybe you could work with a local group to take action in local green spaces. So there's a group there in Congleton who are aiming to plant a tree for every person in Congleton over the next 5 years or so. It's about 30,000 trees. So a whole host of habitat going in that will provide space not only for a wide variety of wildlife, but hopefully then the invertebrate food that things like swifts will feed on. Maybe you form a group to go out and do your survey work as well. I know there's groups in Macclesfield, and there's one in Chester as well, who are coordinating things like surveys. That's 2 that we know of across the whole of Cheshire. There might be others. If there are, then just let us know in the chat. But if you want to get a real good picture of what the swifts are doing in your area, then just informally, you know, a group of like-minded people coming together and going out and doing surveys in the next month or so could make a real difference to our knowledge of where these birds are and how they're faring. And one of the biggest things I think we can do is lobby our local councils, any elected officials really, but especially our MPs, to kind of try and make a difference. So we had a real kind of positive insight that this works just yesterday, when 160,000 people signed a petition asking for targets for wildlife conservation, to reverse population declines, to be set in law by the government. And that happened just yesterday with 160,000 people signing that petition. So we know that petitioning and lobbying people does work. I'm just trying to think, if we all wrote to our local councils and asked them about making sure that new builds definitely have swift bricks put into them as part of their planning policy, then I think it'd be hard to ignore a large number of their constituents coming forward and doing that. So I know that Cheshire East, for example, in their planning policy, 30% of new builds should have in them what bird or bat features, which means a bird box or a bat box inbuilt, which is good. It means 1 in 3 new builds are definitely going to be wildlife friendly in some way. But hopefully you guys now, having known that swifts are nesting colonies and things like that, will know that maybe one nest box in every 3 houses probably isn't quite enough to help a swift colony to form. And they might be better sticking 3 boxes on every house in one street and leaving the others for, say, bats or house sparrows and things like that. Then that's how you can start to make a real difference. It's not only by speaking and petitioning your local councils, being the expert and telling them that it's not just a numbers game, they need to put them up in the right places as well and in the right way. So I think that's definitely something that, even if you can't get out, you're not that kind of group sort of person, that you can actually really start to make a difference by lobbying the people that have the power to make a real difference to our swifts. So I've put a little table there of the actions that you can take. And hopefully what you're doing now is you're reading the action list and you're picking the one that you might want to take. Well, the way I would do this is I'd look at the level. So do I want to take an action on an individual level, or do I want to do something that's going to make a difference to my whole village, my whole town, or do I want to do something that might make a difference to my whole county or my whole country? And I'd probably pick it that way around, because of what I'm very keen on is having as big an impact for wildlife as we can possibly have. Now, if you want to operate at the individual level, that's perfectly fine, that's up to you. And hopefully, if we all act as individuals, we'll all make that big difference together. But hopefully, a few of you are already looking and thinking, maybe I can coordinate a local group. They'll go out and do a few surveys this month, and then we might think about how we fund nest boxes to put up later in the year, and maybe make some changes to our local green spaces as well, and maybe then get in touch with our council and do something that way. So hopefully some of you are looking at that level and thinking about that bigger picture, that bigger impact. So that's the end of the presentation. So what's next? Hopefully it's the start of your action or your project. So hopefully we've given you some ideas of what you can do. And in the follow-up email, we'll send you some more resources, some more materials so you can really start to make that difference. There's a Q&A. Don't use the chat. I don't know why I put use the chat. Use the Q&A tab, because then I can screen all the questions in one go, which we'll jump to now. I've just remembered that I've missed one little bit out about the nesting. So if you do put up new boxes in new areas, you can potentially lure swifts in. And you do this by using a call, like a CD that you can hook up through somebody's loft right up next to the reeds. And it'll play a call in the evening and in the morning in the hope of attracting swifts in. Now, it can be quite good if you're starting a new colony, or if you put up some boxes that might be a little bit further away from the existing colony. And that's the chance then to start looking for birds that will fly around, especially the young looking for nesting next year, that will bang on those nest boxes. Again, there's been some good research on which calls tend to work best. Swift Conservation's your place to go for that, and they sell a CD of the different calls as well. But yeah, so you can attract them in, but it's always better to try and provide additional nesting space on an existing colony. Right, so I'll come out of this presentation now. And hopefully I'll come back on the screen. There we go. So there we go. So the best time to use the recording to entice them in. So we've probably already missed that this time this year, because they'll already be looking to breed, if not already paired up. And so it's probably better to start doing that if they return next year, so early May. So probably from late April to early May. And yeah, you normally set the CD player up with a timer, so it plays in the evening and then again in the morning to try to tempt them in. So let me just close my chat and find the Q&A session. I'll tell you what, whilst I'll do that, we've got some poll questions we're going to ask you as well. So hopefully these come up, hopefully they've not all come up at the same time. So do you know why we need to do you now know why we need to take urgent action for swifts? Yes, no, or you already knew? And we've got a second question of, do you now have the tools to identify and map swifts in your area? So hopefully that very brief session on how to identify those birds should tell you how to identify them. And through the Swift Mapper app, you should have the tools to go out and start mapping those birds. Okay, question 3. Do you now feel like you want to take action to save your swifts? Yes or no? I'm hoping that's 100% yes. I'll be honest. Okay, and then if you had to pick just one action, which would it be? Putting up nest boxes, wildlife-friendly gardening, lobbying people in power, or forming a swift group for your area? And then, are you going to take that action? Yes or no? And then my favourite question, together, as a community, are we going to save swifts? Yes, also yes, no, but yes, really. I'll give you a little bit longer to answer those. So I've got a couple of questions. So Susanna has asked, should you only survey once a year to avoid double counting? No, so you can count on several nights, but all you do is you take your peak count. So if you go one night and you count 15 birds, and then you go another night and you count 20, you assume that there's 20 nests in that colony. So any top tips to count them accurately? So if you can get to somewhere with a good vantage point, obviously if you're in the middle of the street and you've got tall buildings either side of you, you might struggle to see them as they zip overhead. So you can get anywhere with a decent vantage point, so you can see them. So things like green spaces tend to be quite good because they're quite open, and then you can hopefully get quite a good count of those birds as they're whizzing past. So I'm going to end the poll, and then and share the results. So hopefully you can all see that now. So do you know why we need to take urgent action for swifts? Yes. Luckily, some of you already knew, which is great. And then, do you have the tools to identify and map your swifts? Yes. Excellent. And do you now feel like you want to take action to save your swifts? Yes. Brilliant. Thanks. And if you just had to pick one action, what would it be? So wildlife friendly garden, high on that list. Brilliant stuff, because through doing that, you're not only helping swifts, but you're helping other things as well. But there's 2 people looking to form a swift group in their area, which is really, really good. So I know that groups like Swift over Macclesfield, if you download that Swift Mapper app and you zoom in on Cheshire, you can tell which towns or cities have a swift group, because the amount of sightings in those areas are through the roof. So the more people can get forming groups and recording those swifts and taking action for them, all the better. And you can definitely tell where those groups are happening, because the little green logo of nest boxes put up, they also tend to be a lot more common in those towns where a swift group is happening. And are you going to take action? Yes, brilliant. And we are all going to save swifts together as a community, which is brilliant. So as I said, these swifts this year, seeing them was so happy to see them, but it's kind of tinged with that thought that there should be twice as many, and there might be a future me stood there who's looking at half as many as I saw just this week, and that was a really sad thought. So I think it's really great to see people like yourselves coming together and deciding that you want to take action for swifts where you live. I think that's an exceptional thing to want to do. I'm just trying to find. So I can't seem to find the Q&A tab, which is interesting. So I can now see the chat. So if anybody does have any more questions, if you want to stick them in the chat, we can have a quick look at them and see if we can answer them. Any more questions, anybody? Yeah, I don't know where the Q&A tab's gone either, Rosie. It's disappeared for me. Yeah, so good point there by Tina. There will be a Swift Awareness Week later in this year, where there'll be lots of events going on. So if you have keep an eye out for that. I'm sure we'll be promoting stuff as well as Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So if you follow us on social media, we could hopefully get you up to date with that and get you out to some Swift events later this year. So what happens if Swift can't find a nesting site? I can only assume that they simply don't nest. And I imagine that's probably one of the leading causes of their decline. So like I say, if they take 4 years to get to breeding age, they might only fledge a couple of young each year. It won't take that long for their population to start declining just from a simple maths, side of things. So yeah, I think it's like most birds. If they can't find somewhere to nest, they simply won't nest. Yeah, unfortunately. So Dave, there was some tips on the sound system. So play early season for previous breeders who've lost their nest sites, and later for the young birds that come back to the UK later. Excellent. So will there be a recording of the session? Yes, there will be. So that'll go out as a link, I think probably to our YouTube channel. I will upload it. But yeah, you'll get a link to the recording of this session, so you can share it with other people that haven't been able to make it. Excellent. Any more for any more? Okay, in which case, I think I'm going to call that a day. Thank you for coming along. We really appreciate it, especially as it's something that is slightly more niche. But hopefully you're here because you want to save these birds and you want to take action for them. And you know, from our point of view as Cheshire Wildlife Trust, we can only say thank you for doing that and volunteering your time, your effort, and your energy into conserving these wonderful birds. So I'm going to call that a day. So hopefully we'll see you again at another webinar in the near future. But until then, get your eyes to the skies, download the SwiftMapper app, and go and record where you see those birds. And yeah, stay safe and stay wild, everybody. We'll see you soon.